Hello there. I heard the story of the end of Ouspensky's life. It was about 2 weeks ago. Noel, who's another fourth way speaker, read it out. And it was good to listen to. I'm very fond of Ouspensky, although he failed in a certain way. But he was a rare kind of man and had a lot of development inside of him. And that was why Gurdjieff treated him in such a special way, giving him the keys to so much knowledge. And Ouspensky remembered it. And eventually one day he spat it all out and wrote his book, which is a tremendous achievement to remember all of that stuff, and an incredible gift. At the end of Ouspensky's book, he says something, and I'm going to read it out. Ouspensky says, "But my personal position in G's work began to change. For a whole year something had been accumulating, and I gradually began to see that there were many things I could not understand, and that I had to go. This may appear strange and unexpected after all I have written so far, but it had accumulated gradually. I wrote that I had for some time begun to separate G and the ideas. I had no doubts about the ideas. On the contrary, the more I thought of them, the deeper I entered into them. The more I began to value them and realize their significance. But I began very strongly to doubt that it was possible for me, or even for the majority of our company, to continue to work under G's leadership. I do not in the least mean that I found any of G's actions or methods wrong, or that they failed to respond to what I expected. This would be strange and completely out of place in connection with a leader in work, the esoteric nature of which I have admitted. The one excludes the other. In work of such a nature, there can be no sort of criticism, no sort of disagreement with this or that person. I'll stop there. It seems to me when Ouspensky says that he has separated G from the ideas, that what Ouspensky is really talking about is the separation in him of his soul from his mind. Like, he wanted to keep them separate. He didn't quite understand that he had to return to his guts. He wanted to keep them separate. He wanted to maintain his false personality, in other words. And perhaps he felt that Gurdjieff was moving ultimately in a religious character. He wanted to separate the man from the ideas, which is completely in contravention of Gurdjieff's teaching, because the man is the ideas, or whatever is real comes directly from the man, from his core. There is no mind that lives alone. Such a mind is disembodied and talks nonsense, you see. But these days, and unexpectedly about 3 weeks ago, all my work suddenly lurched in the direction of playing a role, working with those masks, those many eyes. I had not expected it, and it came in a completely different direction. And now I do many hours in a week of intensive work on them because I found a way in. And it's powerful work. And so I can talk with some authority now about those masks. The problem for Ouspensky is that his masks were relatively real. That's the problem. If you read In Search of the Miraculous, although it's mental, it's a mental representation of the work. But still, it tastes like real. Because although it comes from Ouspensky's mind, his mind, or rather I should say, the characters that he has that are mental and that deal with this kind of knowledge, those characters are sufficiently developed to actually taste like real. They are sufficiently sincere, you see. Ouspensky had very developed masks, intellectual masks. And so we come to the main problem, which is that the masks don't want to let go. They don't really understand. Moreover, for the entire species and for all the spiritual traditions that exist on this planet, they all seem to misunderstand the situation. I can tell you what it is quite straightforwardly. You see, all those characters that we have, they are the attempt of the being to grow into the third story. And it's like trying to climb up to a much higher level. Treacherous mountain. You can't just wake up and be the top third of the mountain. It's not possible. The being has to somehow find a way to grow into it, even though, because it is another stop in the octave, there is a jump. In other words, the identity of the upper story is completely different to the identity of the middle story. In the same way that an animal's identity is completely different to that of a plant, it's a different stop. And the third story identity is completely different. And the question is, how do you get there? And the way the being is doing it is by creating those masks, which are a kind of crystallized handhold in the third story. When you look at somebody, an ordinary person, they're speaking through one of their characters. Their characters are kind of subtle moods that almost imperceptibly subtly shift across the face. One moment there's a mood of sadness, another one a mood of defiance. The next, it's a mask coming from the mother and another mask coming from the father. And you speak to your friend, and very subtly across their face shimmers a mask that was formed by imitation when they were young. And now there is another mask which is formed by pain or some unloving experience that's left a scar. That scar is a mask. And so you speak to your friend, and one mask after another, like a fog, like a subtle change in the wind, is playing across that person's face, and they don't know. And very few people on this planet know, because they say I. They say I, this is me, and so on. And Gurdjieff describes our strange state. And these masks are, the energy has risen up from the lower two stories into the third story and has crystallized something, some sort of, some character. And some of the characters are mental, some are emotional, some are physical. Therefore, those characters are powerful enough to control all three centers of the middle story. But but it's not a real identity, and your identity does not flow into it. It's just some of the energy goes up there. Now this is another thing, is when you speak to somebody and one of the characters is playing on their face, that person has no third story. They are a two-story being, but some of the energy has sort of switched on that face. When you speak to somebody, their face is not really real. They're really speaking from the neck down, or that's where the energy comes from. But their face is like a kind of exploration. It's like an exploration in, behind the scenes of a clothing shop, where you have mannequins and you've got masks. And it's slightly disembodied. That's what's happening for people. And whether humanity is actually rising up, I don't know. Or maybe there's been a fall and we're falling down. I don't really know the answer to that question. Gurdjieff, of course, thought that we had fallen. But in my opinion, that's not quite correct understanding. Because although there may have been a golden age in the past, it was very likely to be a golden age based on the second story. And so people were undisturbed. They were solar men and women, but they were not men and women of the third story. They were men and women who were whole in the second story. In the fall is really the story of humanity trying to rise up into the third story and completely losing the plot. That is what the fall is. That's in my opinion. But the reason why I say all this is because some of those characters, they are not just hanging around. Some of them develop intelligence. Some of them become relatively real. Some, as they live and they play across the face, they start to learn and taste the truth. And Ouspensky had characters like that tasted the truth, especially the intellectual truth. They were relatively real, and his intellect, although it was one-dimensional and in that way sort of out of place, out of balance, but the reason why his books are good is because they taste the truth. And so that becomes, of course, a big problem when you try to explain to your masks that they have to dissolve back into the solar plexus because they've risen up too early. That's a very difficult thing. And those legendary stories of the sacrifice, the man who sacrifices for everyone, who gives his life, that is the story of one of the masks who becomes relatively real and recognizes that he must die in order that the being lives, and that he will live on inside. That's a very difficult thing to learn. So that's a bit of a sit rep.